Good evening, everyone. I think we're ready to go. I'm Steve Aron. I'm the president and CEO here at the Autry Museum of the American West. And as we do with all programs here at the Autry, we'll start by acknowledging the traditional caretakers of the land, the Gabrielino Tongva people. I'd also like to thank the members of the Curator's Circle, whose generosity makes possible this program. I'm honored also that we have several members of our Board of Trustees here to welcome you to this evening's program, Imagining the West in Film, which is a follow-up to a program we did a couple of weeks ago on this spot, Imagining the West in Music. And I suspect it'll be one of a series of programs that we'll do in different ways of imagining through different media as a prelude to and a preview of the opening of our new Imagined Wests Gallery in 2022, which I hope all of you, some of you who are here tonight, had a chance to get a little preview of the prototype of that exhibition. We are really, really excited about it because I think it will be a real signature gallery for the Autry, bringing together many of the issues, themes, collections that are most important to us. So I should just announce that we'll save questions tonight to the end of our program. If you're joining us on Zoom and have questions during our conversation, please enter them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. For those of you here in our live audience, we'll have a microphone circulating to take your questions. So let me start by introducing our panelists for this program on Imagining the West in Film. First, to my right, is Bill Pullman, who needs no introduction. But I'm going to provide him one anyway, or at least a brief one. You may know Bill, as he has appeared frequently on movie and television screens, most recently in the television series Halston, and in noted films and roles in films such as Independence Day, Spaceballs, Casper, While You Were Sleeping. I suppose most relevant, though, for our discussion today, he starred in a remake of the seminal Western, The Virginian. And after our program this evening, he'll be signing copies of this book on the Virginian. And even more relevant, I guess, for our program tonight, he also starred in The Ballad of Lefty Brown. But I will say, among his many credits, the one that matters most is that he's a longtime member and supporter of the Autry Museum. To Bill's right is Jared Moshé, who was the director and screenwriter of the aforementioned film, The Ballad of Lefty Brown, as well as a previous Western, Dead Man's Burden. And we'll be hearing what he's up to, too. So thank you, Jared. And last, but certainly not least, is Adam Piron, the interim director of the Sundance Institute's Indigenous program. He should also be familiar to many of you here, as he frequently participates in the Autry's film series, What is a Western, as one of our guest lecturers. That series explores the wide range of movies that can be considered Westerns and how they shape our understanding of the American West, one of the topics that we'll certainly take up this evening, and it's a topic that we will consider in the Imagined West Gallery. So, I'm going to start with a most unfair question to each of the panelists. What's your favorite Western and why?
Start with me. All right, yeah, sure. I would say my favorite Western is The Great Silence by Sergio Corbucci. It's the second in his Mud and Blood trilogy. So the first one is Django, the original one, and then The Specialists. But yeah, I think I'm always a sucker for spaghetti Westerns and, you know, their sort of vision of the American West, which I always find to some extent I wouldn't say more authentic, but I think more to kind of like the grit and sort of the harshness of that history and the landscape in particular. Yeah, it's. I think it's also one of the only westerns I know of as well too that takes place in a blizzard as well. So it's pretty great. Really good use of the Great Blizzard of 1899. So yeah, check it out.
It'll also make you really cold while you're watching it, so like wear a jacket.
I think that the Hateful Eight has a blizzard scene too.
Yeah, it's a riff on that as well too.
Okay.
So yeah.
Absolutely. Jared?
I hate this question. I think it's unfair, and Steve is putting us in a very uncomfortable position. I have like 10 westerns that rotate between being my favorite at any one time, and I'm just going to choose one out of a hat right now. And I'm going to choose one that I guess is a lesser known of the ones, and not a spaghetti western, since we have a spaghetti western. I'm going to choose The Ballad of Cable Hogue, which is Sam Peckinpah's lesser-known western, the film he got to do after The Wild Bunch, and then everyone was like, why did you make this movie? But it's also his favorite. Jason Robards plays Cable Hogue, a man who's left for dead in the middle of the desert by his partners, and while wandering around talking to God, looking for any way to survive, he finds water where it was never supposed to be, and he sets up a little way station, and he waits for his chance at revenge. But the portrait of the West this film creates is just captivating in its both lyricalness and brutality. It has some of the most beautiful, simple moments I've ever seen on cinema, and I'll leave it at that.
I wish I could have a very arcane Western that I could pull out, done by some Italian guy in some far distant country. But I think, like all of you, it is a hard question to say, and there's different Westerns for different moods, like a mood ring, you can go to it and see comedies and, 70s, psycho westerns, all those. But I think of like the first performance that I was aware of that was intriguing to me in the circumstances was in The Searchers, when John Wayne goes back into the room where and now I'm, of course, forgetting the name of the great actor who played the husband of the wife there. But anyway, he, comes back in, and you realize that he and the wife have had a relationship. And I remember how that I was really, as a pretty young kid, really aware that this was drama. This was something that was unsaid, that was at play, and that I think that took me in an emotional way, so that it wasn't just the landscapes, it wasn't the character of the swagger or anything else. It was the circumstances and how they, kind of drew me into the morality and the painful consequences of their actions. So The Searchers.
In fact, you're all wrong. The correct answer is The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, and it needs no further explanation.
Walk away.
Drop the mic.
Drop the mic.
So, Bill, in an earlier conversation that you and I had, you sort of talked about the sort of beginnings of the Western genre, your own interest in the Virginian, and you invoked a term that I had not heard before. That is Sola Solastalgia, which is a neologism. And I just ask you to explain it and explain how it sort of captures the beginnings of the Western as you thought about it, and certainly as Owen Wister in the Virginian, I think, thought about it. So that's
a very highfalutin question, and I want to, but I. Hello? They don't want to hear the answer. But I'm really glad you're all here tonight, and I am going to answer it, but I have to go a long way out of my way to answer it correctly. But I think this moment kind of came about because of my interest in the Virginian, and I was lucky enough to get a chance to do a version of it in the end of the 1999. It came out in 2000, I think. But I was clearing out my boxes and boxes of things this spring, and I had these boxes of this book that Turner agreed to print, which was called The Virginian at Medicine Bow. And I had, I think, like a couple hundred copies of them. And I said, what am I just going to throw these out? But they're a book that was out of print when we went to make the movie, and it was somebody in Turner who said it would be really helpful if this were in print, wouldn't it? And I said, yeah, we could use it for school groups, so it's very informative, written by a guy, Glenn Barrett, who wrote it in '76, but it charts all the ways in which this novel by Owen Wister, The Virginian, was like the Star Wars of its time. It was, everyone's idea of the West was hyperbolic characters in dime novels. They were all like characters on World Wrestling Federation or something, Billy the Kid, and all those are larger-than-life characters. And all of a sudden, this nuanced story of the West came out, and it took the nation by storm, and it's generally recognized as an origin of a type of Western mythology that we have lived with and then morphed away from. And I think the book is really important to be able to come back to. And Glenn Barrett wrote a book about how Owen Wister came to write the novel, who he based his characters on, and a lot about what happened to the town afterwards. So it says a lot about America. It says a lot about mythology. Right now, Medicine Bow, Wyoming, is where the Owen Wister got off the train. He encountered a stranger who he eventually realizes the person's going to take him 263 miles to a ranch that he's supposed to go to, and that becomes the Virginian. And that book, The Man with No Name, The Virginian, all the kind of basic tenets of so many novels or films. John Ford said he based 5 of his films off of aspects of the Virginian. So this book about the writing of the Virginian, I think, is important for historians, and definitely the next guy, a person, anybody who's going to remake the Virginian will be glad that we put it back in print. And just to chum you in a little bit more, you'll get to have a copy of it for yourself. And I'm doing a pitch for it like you have to pay for it. I don't think you have to pay for it. But it captures what I think is what Owen Wister was. He went first in 1885 and got off the train in Medicine Bow, and his ideas started there. But he wrote the book, and it came out in 1902, 1903. And already the West had had this huge transformation. As Steve knows, there were journalists like Frederick Turner who were saying by 1890, he was saying the West is no longer the West, that the frontier line is no longer the forward westward marching line, that there was no more open range, that the buffalo were gone, the Native Americans were all on reservations. The ideas of what had happened happened so quickly that there became this kind of awareness of people at that time to have a great nostalgia for what was just there 10 years ago. And recently I came across this term that I sprung on Steve trying to make my way into the academe of this place. Sola Solastalgia, which is coined by an Australian sociologist, philosopher, and been picked up. And that is a sense of ache for what we are going to be continuing to lose. And that feeling was so much a part of what Wister was trying to capture, all the things that he had experienced when he first went there that just became extinguished. And I think of it as an important kind of metaphor for something that happens in the West and something that is happening now, where we're aware that our own climate is changing, and there's an ache about the climate, and that sense that we are participating in something that is actually part of the process that's destroying what we ache for. And that's this term solastalgia, which Steve looked up, and but I think it relates to tonight's program a little bit, and then I'll be done with this, which is that the Virginian has captured this, the kind of aspects of the early Western that later came to be, changed and whatnot, but, a sense of adventure, a sense of what it is to be tough, and a sense of integrity. And later, that virtue of integrity became less and less important. It became more and more commented upon and whatnot. But I just wanted to, before I get done, and I know we have question and answer and everything, I want to read a couple of quotes from the Virginian, so that's my hope for a takeaway. You'll read this book, The Virginian and Medicine Bow, and you might read Owen Wister's novel, because I tried to include in my version as much of the dialogue that he had in the book that I could. And he had things like wisdom, where you forget about this aspect of what Westerns were to mean. And also integrity. When a man ain't got no ideas of his own, he ought to be kind of careful who he borrows them from. That's a Western line if I ever heard it. I thought there should, in truth, be heavy damages for malpractice on human souls. Which I think is another one that, to have some quiet-spoken cowboy say that, you listen up. I like this one. For out of the eyes of every stranger looks either a friend or an enemy waiting to be known. When you think about the tension of the Westerns, the most famous line from the Virginian is a line that takes a little explanation, but there's a scene in which the Virginian is at a card table with his, eventually identified as his archenemy, Trampas. And there's a lot of baiting going on, kind of subtextually and everything. And at one point, Trampas is saying he wants another card. He says, "You're going to have to give it to me, you some bitch." And that was an outrageous word in 1902. And it was an outrageous word in the West. And the Virginia has a famous moment where he puts his gun on the table, and he says, "When you call me that, smile." And I think that says something about who he is as a person. He's got authority, he's got toughness, he's got integrity, and he's just saying, you can deliver that in a better way, and we can keep going here, which I think was something about what the Virginia is all about.
I will say this. Solastalgia will be on the quiz at the end of the program. You have to write an essay. But I would say this, now that I've left my position at UCLA, Professor Pullman, there's an opening for you. So I think in Bill's answer, going back to the Virginian, he spoke about the origins of the Western and its sort of beginnings in the 20th century as the reigning and most popular genre in American cinema, and really around the world too. I guess I want to shift now to the other side of the spectrum and talk about the Western genre as it sits today, and where it is. And Jared, I'm going to turn this question to you. You could do it with equal sort of full, but I just think in that you've made two Westerns, which is really remarkable, in that you've also talked about how it has become a ghettoized, stigmatized genre within the industry. And so I guess I'd just ask you to talk about both the challenges of making a Western today and where you think Westerns are today and maybe tomorrow.
The challenge of making a Western today is sort of, I guess, the same challenge John Ford had when he was trying to get pitch Stagecoach around town, and he walked into every studio and said, I have a Western, and they said, who watches Westerns anymore? Someone eventually gave John Ford his money, and then we had a lot of Westerns. Right now, we don't have a lot of Westerns. It's a very ghettoized genre. It's a genre where people look at you and you make a Western and they're like, so what else can you do? Can you make a drama? Can you make an action movie? Can you do something else? As though all those elements aren't part of any good Western. You can, I like to say, like, you can make a little tiny Sundance drama and go on to, and the people are like, okay, cool. You can go do Jurassic Park or Avengers or who knows what. But like, you make a Western, it's like, maybe you'll do a modern Western, and then we'll see what it's like. The genre is one that is, I think, besides the fact that it is a not very lucrative genre for a lot of studios because they say Westerns aren't liked internationally. It's also the only genre in Hollywood that you're basically guaranteed to get in every Walmart in this country because people want to watch them. And some companies have taken advantage of that. The thing about the Western genre today is I think people don't really know what to do with it a lot of the time. You've had these sort of moments of Western, you had the classic Westerns, then you've sort of had those 1950s sort of noirish, darker Westerns. You had spaghetti Westerns, you had the postmodern Westerns, you had the revisionist Westerns, you had the acid Westerns, and then you had then Clint Eastwood made Unforgiven, and everyone was like, all right, we're done. But I think there's a lot rife for exploration in the genre still. It's the myth that America made for itself. And because of that, I think it's something that we have to engage with on multiple levels. Just because there's a lot of BS in there, and it's not, it can be racist, it can be inappropriate, it can be derivative, it can be limited. It was literally created as a genre to reunite the North and South when we're looking west. I mean, it's not a coincidence that the Virginian was from Virginia and not it's not called the, Massachusetts. I should have showed that. Maine? All right, maybe there isn't a good northern. The New Yorker. Would anyone have actually gone and read The New Yorker? But I think there's a way to engage with the genre now, understanding its limitations for what it is and also what it brings us as a country and as a people, because it's a myth. And, for The Ballad of Lefty Brown, one of the things we were trying to do was take those John Wayne tropey characters from from every John Ford movie, from Rio Bravo to The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance to even Stagecoach, and figure out who these men were behind this sort of mythological trope, and put them into the real world.
If you haven't yet seen The Ballad of Lefty Brown, you should go see it tonight. It's on Netflix. So I guess if you could just actually just pause on that for one moment and talk, if you can tell a tale about getting that movie made.
Sure. I had made one Western, this small film we made for $250,000 called Dead Man's Burden. And everyone in Hollywood was telling me to do something else, but this character, Lefty, was stuck with me. I had to get him out of my head. I had to get him onto the page. So I wrote the script and I started sending it around, and people were like, don't make another Western. no one wants Westerns, blah, 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 the whole everything. And then luckily, we found a great champion in this man right here who was the dream to play Lefty. And he loved the script, and he came on board. And even with him, you attached, it took us another like 8 months to get our financing together. And we went and shot it in Montana. And this is true. We shot it like 8 minutes from his house. And that was totally, he might take, do you take credit for that? Because it's not, you didn't, that was a total coincidence. That was the only set we could find in Montana that had like the ranch house we wanted.
I remember a phone call with Jared. I was, this really was the only thing I wanted to do, but I did have to do some other things, and took so long to get together. But he said, by the way, I'm no longer am I just looking at New Mexico. I'm looking at Montana. I said, oh, fantastic. And then he said, we're here scouting now, and I think we found the Hero Ranch. And I said, where are you in Montana? It's a big state, it's like the 4th largest state. And he said, I don't remember the town that it's close to, but it begins with W. And I was like, Wolf Point, that's like 1,000 miles to the east of our ranch. And there were several others. But I said, was it Whitehall, which was the closest town from our ranch? And he said, I'm not sure. And then it was only when you said, I think they shot some scenes from the sequel to the Lonesome Dove. And I said, that's gotta be Whitehall. So it ended up being 20 minutes for part of the locations, where it's 20 minutes from where our ranch is.
He was closer than literally everyone else.
Freakish.
So Adam, let me turn to you and ask you from your perch at Sundance, and also from your perspective, thinking about indigenous Westerns, where that is and where it has come from and where at Sundance it's going.
Yeah, I think within Sundance itself, obviously we have our own, just from the name itself, we have our own legacy of being tied to the Western, and with Robert Redford, and even where, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. But I think in terms of the type of work that my program does in particular, we support Indigenous filmmakers making their films. And I think while there hasn't been anybody that's necessarily made a Western through that program, a lot of what we do, and a lot of what our artists are trying to do, whether as consciously or unconsciously as it is really, sort of pushing back on a lot of the damage that the Western has put forth about Indigenous people. I think in particular, you can think of a lot of the tropes from the very beginning of the Western, even when it was, just starting out in literature, even before film, where there's sort of the two tropes of, sort of this more passive, kind of good Indian that lives, within the forest, kind of when you think of something like Hiawatha or something like that, to, as people were starting to move more west, you'd have a lot more stories that were about, really pitting Indigenous people as sort of the villains in a lot of these stories. And kind of the idea that an Indian that fought against sort of Western expansion was a bad Indian, so to speak. So I think there's a lot within, and even I think if you take it even further, I think, there's a lot of things that something that you'd brought up as well too with some of the things within Westerns is that I don't think it has necessarily a great history of sort of, it has a lot of histories that, how would I put this? It has a really good history of, I think, questioning a lot of the motives of individuals and, sort of a lot of individual values when it comes to the West. I know that there are a lot of Westerns as well too that have really sort of put forward the question of what is sort of the complicity of a lot of our country or a lot of our culture when it comes to genocide as well too. In kind of particular to what Bill was talking about, sort of that nostalgia, once that hits in with film, it's I think people kind of were starting to realize sort of the damage that not just a lot of that history was sort of doing, but also in particular sort of the narratives and the myths that were being put forth. But that also being said, I mean, even from as early as 1909, there were indigenous people making films that were, in fact, Westerns. I think a lot of them were trying to reframe a lot of how indigenous people were looked at, both from a cultural standpoint or even just within a lot of the tropes that were being put forth with film. And it goes forward, and I know with your silent film posters, a little bit down the line, you have Ramona as well too, which that was directed by Edwin Caryu, who is Chickasaw director and making a film about an indigenous person here in California as well too. So, we've definitely have been in the mix both within and behind the Western. And yeah, that's kind of what I would have to say about it. I think it's really about, I think for us, in a lot of ways, it's both kind of a thing of looking at the myth and what that's meant to us in terms of our own cultures and our own histories and a lot of the trauma that we've gone through. But also, to a certain extent, I think there is some nostalgia in there with, kind of where maybe our cultures were at certain points in those histories and, looking at that and, it's our own nostalgia to a certain extent of like looking at some of those cultures and, how we can sort of, to a certain extent, mythologize some people within our own histories and stuff like that and how they show up in some of these stories as well, too.
I had asked at the beginning about what your favorite Western was, and I guess I want to shift it now, not necessarily what your favorite Western is, but if you could remake one Western, which one would you like to remake, and tell us how you would do it to make it sort of worthy of being remade? We'll start down at that end.
Yeah, sure. I think I'd remake the Westerns. Or sorry, not the Westerns, the Searchers. Sorry, Bill. But I think the way I would remake it is I would make it about an indigenous family and them tracking down, the niece that ends up going into the boarding school system and being put into, that version of assimilation and, seeing what that looks like from, the John Wayne type character going on that kind of rampage and how that's taken. So
That one made. Jared.
I hate this question too. Do you have an answer, Bill?
Not as good as yours.
What Western? I don't really believe in remakes. I mean, even your Searchers idea doesn't feel like a remake. It's like taking the concept and turning it into something else. Assault on Precinct 13 is Rio Bravo kind of thing. I'll remake the Virginian because Bill just threw the gauntlet down that someone has to do it. And then I'll bring him on as a consultant to make sure I get the Sola Solastalgia right.
I have James Drury in mind, so I think I would have a small part delivering a message or something, maybe. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, good.
I'll call your agent.
Yeah. Well, I thought it was an interesting choice to play Dead Man today. That was your choice, wasn't it, Adam? Yeah, with the great Gary Farmer, and really is such a inventive and surprising thing. And Gary Farmer is in the Virginian that I have been, but my son, who is a product of LA and the fact that our family has had a big contact with the Autry Museum. Our middle son is a creative puppet and mask maker, and but he has a very specific interest in the singing cowboy. And I wonder if it was because he could come to the, that we used to come to the Autry because the lawns were really so good. When they're 2 or 3, that's pretty good museum trip, and but they remain good, Steve. They are very good lawns, but now you have many other things to offer, and but he couldn't be here today. But I think he has a post-apocalyptic story that is about a singing cowboy and Native American. That there's, I think, a really brilliant kind of revisioning of the fun of the singing cowboy, kind of like the Coen brothers had a little taste of it, but his version of it is I think, a little more adventurous, and it reminded me a little bit of, he's the one that plugged me into the fact that Neil Young's soundtrack for Dead Man is really kind of a brilliant piece of music, and his version of the music for the singing cowboy and Native American is kind of has a little connection to that. Sounds good, doesn't it?
Okay, where are the financiers who are going to get these movies made now? Okay, so we're going to open it up for questions from the audience, both on the Zoom and in our audience. And Brian, are you there with the microphone somewhere? But while we're waiting to sort of circulate that to the audience, I will just say again about Imagined West, and I think this is related to the larger question of where is the Western, or where was the Western, where is the Western? Josh Garrett Davis, who is out here somewhere, a curator here at the Autry and the lead curator for the Imagined West's gallery, about which we're speaking, has sort of talked about the distinction, or draws the distinction between Western with a capital W, which is the genre as we understand it, and then Western with a small lowercase w, which are all the ways in which stories about the West get told by all sorts of different people. And I think our ambition at the Autry is really to try to sort of bring those things together, to still tell in the Imagined West Gallery the stories of how the Western, capital W, as a genre has evolved from even before the Virginian, from its origins in dime novels, and then into the Wild West shows, and then the Virginia, or the silent Westerns, and the Virginian in particular as an archetype, and then tracing that genre through the 20th century and into the 21st, but also the Western with a lowercase w, am I getting this right, Josh? Which are all the other ways in which these stories get told, and indeed, the Autry's mission being to tell the stories of all peoples of the American West, and connecting the past with the present to inspire our shared future. And you can see the ways in which really the Autry's lane is to kind of do these things together, to sort of try to mash them up in some way and see what happens when you have all of these voices and visions playing off one another, which I think in some ways is where some 21st century Western should go, would be my take on it. I don't think that made any sense coherently as a script, but at least as an Autry ideal, it really, I think, speaks to what we want to do here, to get people beyond playing on our lawn and into our museum. So let's take some questions from our audience and from Zoom. Brian is circulating. There we go.
What about comedy? You know, some of my favorite Westerns are comedies. Blazing Saddles.
Blazing Saddles is amazing. I mean, that movie like rips apart the genre of the West, and then like somehow manages to pull it back together and make it wonderful at the same time. It's just crazy what like Mel Brooks was able to make with it. I also like a Western. I think it's The Frisco Kid. You know, a Jewish comedian Western with starring a Jew, which I think is a hilarious other comedy. What? Yeah, I think so. Yeah. But yeah, no, the Western comedy genre is amazing.
Well, I would say if we're going to stretch the genre in the way that I guess and I don't want to pitch an exhibition at a competing museum, but I guess it did open this week, the Star Trek exhibition at the Skirball. You know, and Star Trek being a sort of space Western, and I guess if we're thinking of Mel Brooks, then also Spaceballs would.
That is the final frontier. Yes. Lone Star, yes.
Hi, I am not very well versed in the genre of Westerns, but the movie Godless really struck a chord with me. It was really powerful to see women working together, being independent and fierce. What is the role of women in Westerns going forward? If we're going to mythologize the American culture, where do women play in the future of those movies?
Yeah. Oh, is that for Bill?
Anyone, go all of you.
Yeah, no, I think that opens up like a lot as well too. I think definitely the place of historically of like women in the Western and that part of the history has not really been fully explored. I think there's a lot of that. Obviously speaking from an Indigenous standpoint, the Western tends to frame one perspective really. There's even other things as well too. Like 1 in 4. I think they estimated like 1 in 4 cowboys were black and stuff, and that's just something that's not seen. But I mean, the same thing with women as well too, with their place on the frontier. And yeah, I mean, I'm with you on that. So.
Yeah, I think it's an important area that has not been covered as well. I mean, I think I remember with Godless, like Scott Frank read about that town and like he was inspired to write the script based on that idea. And then there's the Kelly Reichardt Western with Michelle Williams, do you remember, what's the title? I'm blanking.
Meek's Cutoff?
Meek's Cutoff, which is very much about the female experience on it's the fact that she actually shot that movie in Super 16 in a very tight frame because she wanted to give the audience the experience of what it is to look through like a bonnet that those women were wearing and to have that part of the world cut off from you. But I think the female experience on the West is something that needs to be explored more, and it's unique in different ways because it is a forgotten part of the genre in many ways.
I watched the movie Dead Men here this afternoon at the Autry. I found it to be very immersive. I wanted to ask the panel, which Westerns do you find to be very immersive?
That's a good question. I mean, I think one that I've thought of a lot recently, which is like, if we're stretching the definition of the Western, but Australia actually has their own history with making Westerns as well that really borrow from a lot of American Westerns as well. I think there's a film called The Proposition. It's written by Nick Cave from The Bad Seeds. Check it out. It's Guy Pearce, Danny Houston, and a couple other folks. But it's a really, really great sort of like sensorial experience. It's about these 3 outlaw brothers where one of them's out on the run, 2 of them get captured, and the law essentially tells one of the brothers that like you need to go find your other brother and bring him back here so we can execute him, and if you don't, we're going to kill your other brother. So it's this really sort of like tight, exhausting film, but it's like a really sort of beautiful film in terms of how it takes in the outback and I think even just that time period. It's a similar time period to the U.S. Western as well too. So.
Yeah. Oh, I was going to say that is all a very immersive Western, and you kind of stole what I was going to say. I'm going to go with the cold Westerns. The Great Silence is incredibly immersive in that world, or like the McCabe and Mrs. Miller. Also, you feel like you're just in, it's that Altman style of just bringing you into the world. And it feels very, I don't know, those Westerns both make me want to pull on like a bearskin around my back and hide.
I've kind of been thinking about your question about women and Westerns, and I find it so interesting. This year, we're getting such interesting movies directed by women that are in the West. Chloe Zhao did this movie called The Rider, which I think is so excellent a movie, contemporary story of the West, but one of the most really authentic pieces when you think about what it is to be. She's looking at masculinity in these Native American rodeo guys, and then what damage it's done to them. I think that's been the best Western made in a long time. And Jane Campion, who's another great director who I've always thought her films are some of the best films of the last 25 years. She's doing, I can't remember the title, something to
Dog or something? Power of the
Power
Dog?
of a Dog, which I think also looks at kind of a kind of a prism of looking at masculinity, femininity, and because, I mean, just powerful influence that these women have had on our storytelling about the West now.
Yes, I'd like to recommend a film called Woman Walks Ahead with Jessica Chastain. And it's a true story. She plays a fine artist who has a commission to travel to the West from the East Coast to paint Sitting Bull's portrait. And it's an actual true story of dealing with prejudice against her as a single woman doing this. And she actually did paint the portrait, and it exists today in a museum, I think, in South Dakota. It's an excellent film.
Is it on? Thank you. That sounds really cool. I actually haven't seen that yet.
I should mention, as long as I'm plugging Autry projects, and this one's a little further out on the horizon, our curator, Tyree Boyd Pates, is at work on a reimagining of an exhibition on the Black Cowboy. So, but I think that's slated probably about 2026 now. So just keep it in mind.
If I can be film specific to the one we were talking about with The Legend of Lefty, I was kind of curious that you shot this on film and why your choice was to shoot it on film, if it was an homage to Westerns, and if you, Mr. Pullman, were actually attracted to that it was on film, or if there was any kind of additional draw.
Well, I was following the lead of Jared Moshé, who really has interest and fierceness about that. So I think you better speak to that.
I think, can you tell me a Western that wasn't shot on film that looks good? I mean, gosh, I feel like I was reading a review of a Western recently, and they were just like talking about how these should be, like, why can't, there needs to be like a part of the agreement that every Western needs to be shot on film. We shot on, for me, it was really, it wasn't an argument. It was, we're shooting this film on film because it's a Western, and I feel like digital Westerns don't look quite right. Though we ended up shooting on 2perf 35, which is like half of a 35 millimeter negative, and we did that because we wanted to capture in camera like the natural widescreen look of the genre. The landscape is such an important character, I think, in a Western, and you need to see that even in close-ups when the actor's face is as expressive as Bill's. You want to be able to see the land behind him to understand what is the world he's reacting to. It also creates a nice sense of grain and grittiness as opposed to shooting on digital where you have to put that in after the fact.
I didn't shoot anything on film.
Why not?
I'm not sure where Brian is, because I no longer can see into the audience because it's now dark here.
It's back there.
Okay.
Being a Wyatt Earp nerd, I'm going to bring up the elephant in the room. Now, I've brought this up before, and I've seen fights break out, but up there, Wyatt Earp with Kevin Costner, or Tombstone with Kurt Russell. Now, I know there's a person sitting up there that was in one of these movies who did an excellent job, but which one would you say is your favorite depiction of the OK Corral with Wyatt Earp?
My darling Clementine?
Gunfight at the OK Corral?
Yeah, I thought Tombstone was a great movie. Great movie. Maybe it captured many things. It's so good to have two versions of it and so many other versions of the OK Corral. And I always will know that we probably don't have any reference to the OK Corral in the Imagining West thing, but will there be anything about the OK Corral? 'Cause
Josh, where are you? Josh, bring a microphone to Josh. Hold on. He's moseying.
I don't think we have an OK Corral, I am afraid to say.
We're killing some tropes here.
Well, you know, if you remember, the Autry in its original incarnation for many years had that OK Corral, somewhat out of date version until I think, I'm not even going to, I can't even begin to tell the story of what happened when people broke in and repositioned the characters on the OK Corral set there. Wasn't pretty.
Oh, thanks, Brian. So my favorite Western with a W is Unforgiven, and my Western with a little W is Thelma and Louise. I just was wondering what your thoughts are on shows like Yellowstone that are now coming out and telling all of the different stories, weaving them together.
I didn't get the last part of that question.
What your thoughts are about weaving all of the different kinds of stories together in shows like Yellowstone that are coming out. I mean, I know Yellowstone is what it is because I love it, but I just, they're trying to weave a lot of different stories that come in from what people think of as a Western inside of that story, and I didn't know if that was something that you also thought was a good idea with bringing a lot of different stories in.
I mean, I guess my thing would be the Western's never really been anybody's story. Like, it's been constantly repurposed from you have films by John Ford that were then, influencing Akira Kurosawa making samurai films that then turned into spaghetti Westerns and then back to the US. So, I think it's fine. I think, speaking on that too, I think it's also worth it if you haven't checked it out. Reservation Dogs, which is also on, Indigenous TV show, based in Oklahoma, also plays on a lot of different tropes as well too, and sort of deconstructing them as well. But I guess, I don't know if that answers your question, but.
So I would that gives me a little bit of a time to plug yet another Autry project, and that is over here, Native Voices at the Autry, of whom several of the alums are in that production, as well as some others coming out, like Killers of the Flower Moon, which will be out, Martin Scorsese's new movie that's coming out next year. Also features some Native Voices at the Autry alums, or members of that theater company that we have here. And I would ask everyone to mark on your calendars November 13th and 14th, which is the Native Voices at the Autry Short Plays Festival weekend. So make sure you're back here then too.
Some of my favorite Western authors, like Cormac McCarthy, have had their books already made into movies. I'd like to hear your views on what are some of the younger writers, particularly the Native writers, that you think are going to be the writers for the films of the future.
That's a good question. I think a lot of them are directing, but I would look at a lot of the writers from Reservation Dogs or other things. Like, there are people like Black Horse Lowe, who's a Navajo writer-director, Sterling Harjo, who's the showrunner for Reservation Dogs. There are a number of different films that have also come out recently. Like, I think if there's a film that came out called Wild Indian that was directed by Lyle Corbine. I'm actually putting out a blog piece through Sundance that goes out on Indigenous Peoples Day on Monday, so keep an eye out for that. It's got a list of folks on there, so it's probably easier.
So I think we have time for one more question. So.
While we're waiting, Steve, I just wanted to remind folks that we're screening The Rider on the next.
Oh, which day is it?
November 6th.
November 6th. So you people, you're going to be here November 6th for the screening of The Rider, and November 13th and 14th for Native Voices at the Autry Short Plays Festival. And we'll probably get you here the following weekend, too. Wait, one last question. Brian's making his run.
So much of the West is celebrating the myth of the hero, I was wondering who your favorite villain was.
All right. I'm going to say Gene Hackman in Unforgiven. Because there's a different version of that movie where he is the hero. And that's kind of interesting to me. I mean, essentially, he's like Dirty Harry, right? And he's portrayed as this, like, he's the law and order guy who will do anything to protect the law, and he's the villain. And I find that super compelling, and his performance is super compelling. That's what I got.
Oh, me? I don't know. Bill, do you have any? No. I'd probably say, not to be like smart aleck about this, but I think like I'd probably say, if you've seen like Deadwood, the series, Hearst in that in particular, because I think Hearst is somebody who's still like molding a lot of our reality today, and a lot of different things as well. So I think just sort of the legacy of like a lot of those people, but I think he's somebody in particular that has really continued to sort of shape the world, and for better or worse, however you want to take that. But yeah, that's who I would say is probably, I think, in my mind, sort of the Godzilla of like Western villains to a certain extent.
I don't know, maybe I keep thinking about the assassination of Jesse James, and Casey Affleck, is a central character of it, but also kind of a villain of it as well. And it's a really nuanced version of a villain, and kind of the scariest one for me, ultimately.
On that note, thank you very, very much. Again, let me thank the members of our Curator Circle, or members of our Board of Trustees, for making this and so many other programs and projects at the Autry possible. And let me thank then Bill, Jared, Adam, for joining us this evening for this program, and whetting appetites for Imagined Wests 2022, a new core gallery at the Autry that will, I think, bring it all together and bring it home. Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming.